people who study public health have been saying, listen, this is going to happen. It's only a matter of time.
This is a message from the government's chief medical officer about coronavirus.
You should now only go out when absolutely necessary for food, medicine, work, or exercise. Always try to stay 2 meters apart. Do not meet others outside your household, even friends and family.
I think this disease is remarkably infectious, even compared to influenza, the flu. And so even though we were prepared, we were almost overrun by the ferocity of the pandemic. It's highly transmissible, like other coronaviruses, which would only cause a common cold. You know, if you're in the room with somebody with a cold, you're likely to get the cold. But the problem with this virus is it doesn't stop in the nose, it doesn't stop in the lung, it can spread very rapidly into the rest of the body. And that's why it is such a dramatic disease.
Portobello Road in the heart of London's Notting Hill district, normally packed with people and tourists from all over the world. Now, in March 2020, its deserted streets, shuttered shops, closed schools, empty public transport, queues. The deadly COVID-19 virus that hit the world in the early months of 2020 led to scenes like this everywhere.
We all breathe, and it's very difficult to completely isolate the breaths of one person from another, so that it is likely the respiratory diseases the respiratory viruses that are going to be the real problem in terms of epidemics and pandemics, for now and in the future.
But this is just the latest in the series of pandemics that has devastated populations and societies across the world through the ages.
When I was a child, in the 50s, there were many diseases around. I got hepatitis, there was polio around, and you would see people who were crippled. And we were aware all the time of the dangers of infection, and the doctor would come to your home and treat you for that. But what's happened since then, we brought in antibiotics and we brought in vaccines, and gradually we've driven many of the infectious diseases, not necessarily out of the richer countries, but into hidden healthcare components of the richer countries, often into hospitals away from the community. This hasn't happened in many parts of the world, for example, on the African continent, where they're dealing with diseases like this on a daily basis.
Each disease is slightly different from every other disease, and the problem with this COVID-19 virus is that we can't quite predict how this is going to turn out. We cannot predict at the moment how long immunity will last, whether it will be solid immunity, whether everyone becomes immune, whether you become more immune if you've had a more severe illness and have less immunity if you've shrugged it off quickly. We just don't know. These are still questions that are up in the air.
Diseases and viruses such as smallpox, bubonic plague, tuberculosis and influenza are some of the most brutal killers in human history. Outbreaks of these diseases across international borders are defined as pandemics. How did they change the world in the past? Why do they still happen? And how will they change the world again?
This will be a continuing battle. I think we thought we were winning the battle after around 1950s, and this is a reminder, the COVID-19 outbreak, that it is a continuing battle and it will continue on into the future.
Australia is a long way from anywhere, at the bottom of the world. It's a land of unique flora and fauna. For most of its long history, it was isolated from the rest of the planet. With European arrival, it was devastated by diseases, which affected both its unique landscapes and the indigenous people. Many of the Europeans who arrived in Australia just over 200 years ago arrived here in Sydney Harbour. Today, on a remote headland overlooking the harbour, a collection of buildings stand as a reminder of a silent partner that accompanied them: disease. A quarantine station here was the place where arriving passengers and crew suspected of carrying diseases on arriving ships were held. The quarantine station remained here for most of Australia's history, since early European settlement. Quarantine, a blunt instrument used for centuries, is being used once more. But through the ages, men have searched and found cures for new diseases, and they are doing so again.
The idea that vaccines or drugs are silver bullets is rather naive, or it certainly you need to be far more nuanced in your thinking there. These are extremely valuable weapons in our armoury against infectious diseases, but they suffer from two problems. Sometimes when we want them to work, they don't work, and sometimes they cause problems in addition to the problem they're trying to solve. And that's true of drugs, and it's true of vaccines.
Humans have always caught diseases from animals. In fact, most new infections and diseases come from wildlife.
It really goes back to the time when humans first became urbanized and formed clusters themselves, where they moved from being hunter-gatherers, if you like, into more organized society. That's probably when the first mini-pandemics occurred.
The history of human civilization has been increasing contact with animals, starting with agriculture, where we had domestication of animals. We had also things like grain stocks and such, which brought in other non-domesticated animals like mice and rats and other rodents. We've had expansion into wilderness areas with agriculture, with need for housing, need for lumber, need for other raw materials, which brought us in contact with animals. So there's been these tendencies to have increasing contact with animals that we have not had contact with before.
But environmental changes are speeding up this process, while the explosion of city living and international travel means that when these diseases emerge, they can spread more quickly. Most animals carry a range of pathogens, bacteria, and viruses, which can cause disease. A pathogen is an organism that causes disease. The pathogen's evolutionary survival depends on infecting new hosts, and jumping to others is one way to do this. The new host's immune system tries to kill off the new pathogen, meaning that the two are locked eternally in an evolutionary game of trying to find new ways to vanquish each other.
We encounter new pathogens all the time. The vast majority of the pathogens we encounter are either not very successful at infecting humans or transmitting between humans, or are dealt with very easily by our immune system. Now, there's some very small fraction that's able to infect humans directly from animals, something like bird flu. A very small fraction of those are able to actually transfer from one human to another, such as MERS, and an even smaller fraction of those are able to jump from one human to another human with enough transmission that it could actually cause an outbreak.
Wild animals often harbor viruses. Bats, for instance, can carry hundreds of them. And viruses jumping from species to species can ultimately infect people. With human urbanization, a vicious cycle develops. More people bring more deforestation. Human expansion and loss of habitat ultimately kills off predators, including those who feed off rodents. With the predators gone, or at least their numbers sharply diminished, the rodent population explodes. And as studies in Africa show, so does the risk of zoonotic disease. The situation is only likely to get worse, as it has been for centuries. A major proportion of East Asia's population still lives in rural areas. Urbanization is expected to continue for decades. Tropical regions rich in biodiversity already hold a large pool of pathogens, greatly increasing the chance that a novel pathogen will emerge. The farming system throughout Africa and Asia doesn't help. On both continents, many families depend on subsistence farming and a minuscule supply of livestock. Disease control, food and housing for those animals is extremely limited. Cattle, chickens and pigs, which can carry endemic disease, are often in close contact with each other, and a variety of non-domestic animals and humans. Live animal markets, commonplace throughout Asia and Africa, feature crowded conditions and the intimate mixing of multiple species, including humans. This too plays a key role in how a killer pathogen could emerge and spread between species. Another risk is bushmeat hunting and butchering, which is particularly widespread in sub-Saharan Africa. These activities not only threaten animal species and irrevocably change ecosystems, they also bring people and wild animals together. Bushmeat hunting is a clear and primary path for zoonotic disease transmission.
With bushmeat, what you're doing is you're going out and you're trapping or catching wild animals, which might bite, which might scratch, and then you're butchering them, which puts you in direct contact with a lot of their bodily fluids. And so it's very easy for pathogens to jump from these wild animals to humans through the mechanism of bushmeat. An alternative to bushmeat is factory farming, high-density farming, but then that causes the conditions that are ripe for pathogens jumping from a wild population into a domestic population, like domestic poultry, in a way that allows the pathogen to jump into a human population.
So is traditional Chinese medicine, which purports to provide remedies for a host of conditions like arthritis, epilepsy, and erectile dysfunction. Although no scientific evidence exists to support most of these claims, Asia is an enormous consumer of traditional Chinese medicine products.
That's Morpheus, and this is mercury.
Another factor, which is the use of wild animals as pets.
How come you're so beautiful?
The trade in exotic animals is a very effective way of conveying pathogens all around the world in ways that put them in direct contact with potential human hosts.
Tigers, bears, rhinos, pangolins, and other animal species are poached so their body parts can be mixed into these questionable medications. This too is a major contributor to increasing animal-human interactions. Demand is likely to go up as online marketing soars along with Asia's relentless economic growth. These trends have become very well established in the last 100 years, but plagues and pandemics have been around for as long as man himself.
The ones that really affect or influence history are the ones that have these large demographic impacts. If 30% or half the population is killed, that withdraws an awful lot of people from the labor force. It disrupts social and political institutions in ways that make it very hard for them to recover.
The remote plains of Central Asia. For centuries, the people here have hunted rodents like the marmot for survival, as they still do today. The plains here are separated by the Tian Shan Mountains in Central Asia, which border Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and China. It's thought the expansion of nomadic peoples who moved west had a role in spreading plague from its origin in Central Asia, eventually arriving in the Black Sea. The plague of Justinian was a pandemic that afflicted the Byzantine, or Eastern Roman Empire, and especially its capital, Constantinople, in the 6th century. Merchant ships arriving from Black Sea ports harboured rats that carried fleas infected with plague. This became one of the deadliest pandemics in history, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 25 to 100 million people during the following 2 centuries. It was named after Emperor Justinian I, who caught the disease but survived.
The outbreak began in 542, but then there were recurrent episodes of plague over the next 10, 12 years or so. And we know that by the end of this period, the Byzantine Empire was thrown into turmoil. It's said that something like a third or more of the population was stricken and died. The losses in Rome itself were huge, so it struck right at the heart of the Roman Empire. The usual narrative about the plague of Justinian is that that's what resulted in the breakup of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of what were known as the Dark Ages. In a similar way that we're used to, COVID starting slowly, it started with, 1 or 2 people falling ill, not really realizing, but in this case, we know that the infection was very, very rapid. Once people developed symptoms, they would progress to very severe illness and end up dead in a matter of days. So it was shocking and fearful.
The deadliest plague in history was the second major case of bubonic plague, commonly known as the Black Death. The dance of death, the danse macabre, an allegory on the universality of death, was a common painting motif during the late medieval period.
It killed between a third to half Europe's then population, up to 75 million people. So yes, the demographic impacts were immense.
Also originating in the East and China, the disease spread west along the Silk Roads again, reaching the Black Sea and Mediterranean. Trade ships then spread the disease to the rest of Europe, hitting Italy first in Sicily and Venice in 1347, and the rest of Europe over the next 3 years. This remains the deadliest plague outbreak in history. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, derived from the rat flea, which results in several forms of plague, is believed to have been the cause again.
Typically, you would very quickly develop a fever, headache, start to feel very ill, but the distinctive marks that terrified everyone were when the plague bacillus got into the lymph nodes, so under the arms, the back of the legs, and you would develop these large swellings that would turn duck and exude pus, called boo-boos, so hence the term bubonic plague. The odor that came from people's bodies was very distinctive and off-putting to anyone who happened to be passing nearby them. So, typically people who developed those symptoms would rapidly worsen and they would die very, very, very quickly.
Monks, nuns and priests were especially hard hit since they cared for victims of the Black Death. The plague created a number of religious, social and economic upheavals with profound effects on the course of European history. It took 200 years for Europe's population to recover to its previous level. Land values declined by 40%, and there were labour shortages. But for the remaining working class, food was cheaper and lands more abundant, heightening the end of feudalism.
Suddenly, there were a lot of farms that were empty because the farmers had died from the plague, so therefore there was land that wasn't being farmed. So that directly affected the tithes that the manor houses could collect. But the other crucial factor, it meant that those farmers left suddenly found their wage bargaining power greatly enhanced. And we know this was a big issue because there was an attempt to restrict the ability of farmers to say, well, actually, if you want me to farm this land, you have to pay me more for my labor because I've got a better offer from the next manor house.
Many minority groups, such as Jews, were blamed. This led many Jews to relocate to Poland, where they were welcomed, leading to the large population there until the Holocaust during the Second World War.
People blamed particular ethnic groups. The Jews in particular were seen or blamed for that plague. It was thought in parts of Eastern Europe and even parts of sort of Northern Europe that Jews were responsible for it because they'd somehow poisoned the wells.
The problem with fear that comes with a pandemic is that it also leads to blame, and that people, they can't quite accept that there's nobody to blame here. This is an act of God, if you like, in old parlance. It's just one of those things. They have to say, well, why did it happen? We have to blame someone.
Xenophobia, you have had protectionism, you have had this sense of we need to protect ourselves from those people who have this disease with all of those consequences.
Very similar to modern conspiracy theories, the poor thought that this was a plot by the state and the medical profession to reduce their population.
Now we have people thinking that it's 5G mobile networks that is responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic.
Can be a form of fake news that can spread when it's not warranted. There have been cases where in India, for example, where doctors have been beaten up because people are worried that the doctors are going to spread virus to them and things like that.
In the past, as now, you have a lot of misinformation. So for instance, with malaria, the name malaria comes from this notion of bad air, because malaria was seen as caused by the types of bad air characteristic of swamps. With influenza, again, influenza was seen as emerging from the influence of heavenly bodies. That's how we end up with the name influenza. With leprosy, which was a very disfiguring illness, was seen as an affliction given to you by God for your sins.
Religious fervour and fanaticism erupted in the wake of the Black Death. Gypsies, lepers, and others with skin diseases such as acne were killed throughout Europe. But there was a religious painting renaissance, and some scholars claimed it was a contributing factor to the Renaissance itself. Peter Bruegel's The Triumph of Death reflects the social upheaval and terror that followed plague. The painting shows a panorama of an army of skeletons wreaking havoc across a blackened, desolate landscape. Fires burn in the distance and the sea is littered with shipwrecks. A few leafless trees stud hills otherwise bare of vegetation. Fish lie rotting on the shores of a corpse-choked pond. Here there is scorched, barren earth, devoid of any life as far as the eye can see. In this setting, legions of skeletons advance on the living, who either flee in terror or try in vain to fight back. In the foreground, skeletons haul a wagon full of skulls. In the upper left corner, others ring the bell that signifies the death knell of the world. People are herded into a coffin-shaped trap decorated with crosses, while a skeleton on horseback kills people with a scythe. The painting depicts people of different social backgrounds, from peasants and soldiers to nobles, as well as a king and a cardinal, being taken by death indiscriminately. The Black Death saw the introduction of quarantine in an effort to protect coastal cities from plague epidemics. Cautious port authorities required ships arriving in Venice from infected ports to sit at anchor for 40 days before landing. The word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, or 40 days. While Europeans had developed limited immunity against some diseases such as smallpox, hundreds of thousands were still dying from disease. The Black Death had never really gone away, and in the 17th century, the bubonic plague came back again. One of the most distressing results of Europe's original pandemic and its recurrences was that the dead could not be buried decently. This was a basic mercy of the Christian community, as Caravaggio shows in this shadowed vision of people doing good deeds on the mean streets of Naples. A priest holds up a torch as a man is carried to burial by night, his feet peeping out from his shroud. In his eyewitness account of the Black Death in Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio tells how mourning broke down and bodies were dumped in the street. Plague pits that have been discovered crammed with bodies confirm that the dead were dumped in mass graves. The infamous outfit worn by so-called plague doctors was thought to have originated in Italy, but later spread throughout Europe. The protective suit consisted of a light waxed fabric overcoat, a mask with glass eye openings, and a beak-shaped nose, typically stuffed with herbs, straw, and spices. The scented materials included juniper berries, roses, mint leaves, cloves, and myrrh. It was believed this suit would protect the doctor from putrid air, which it was thought was the cause of the disease. Plague doctors would also commonly carry a cane to examine and direct the patients, without the need to make direct contact with the patient. Plague doctors were typically inexperienced, often second-rate, and sometimes not doctors at all. In Venice today, where masks are still worn at Carnival, they include the infamous beaked ones. The plague doctors would be needed again later in the 17th century, when the plague would once again devastate European cities. In London, the Great Plague, lasting from 1665 to 1666, was the last major epidemic of bubonic plague to occur in England.
Modern London certainly sits on the bones of the dead.
London at that time was a city of about 448 acres, surrounded by a city wall.
Well, London in 1665 is a very large city by early modern standards. It's the largest or the second largest in Western Europe. It has a population of perhaps 450,000. Its main business, its main reason is overseas trade, but it also has a major governmental function. It is the capital of a nation state and also of the beginnings of an empire.
But many Londoners in 1665 were poor or poverty-stricken, in a city with little or no sanitation and belching smoke coming from factories. Plague had taken hold in many European cities, such as Amsterdam in the early 1660s. It was in bales of cotton imported on Dutch ships that the plague allegedly came to Britain. Ships were quarantined on the Thames and other ports for 30 days before being allowed to travel upriver, but it was too late.
One of the most difficult and dreadful things about the plague was, in the early part of it, you would know that it was going to happen. You could look back on the experience of the last century when there had been 4 or 5 major epidemics, and you would know in May that it was beginning to be a major epidemic and that it would get worse and worse up until at least September, if not October, and that literally thousands of people would die. So in a sense, it's that foreknowledge, that experience that may help you to prepare for it in administrative terms, but that also means you are in no doubt about how bad it's going to be.
The Great Plague killed an estimated 100,000 people, almost a quarter of London's population, in just 18 months. As plague spread, a system of quarantine was introduced, whereby any house where someone had died from plague would be locked up and no one allowed to enter or leave for 40 days.
As soon as somebody in a household is perceived to have plague or dies of plague, then quarantine is imposed on that household. The household is meant to be locked up with a warder at the door, with a mark on the door, so that the people can't go out. Another kind of quarantine is to take sick people to the pest house, which is not so much a hospital for curing people, but a place where sick people can be taken so they will not infect any other people. So that's part of the overall quarantine, moving the plague sick out of the city itself.
Samuel Pepys provided a contemporary account of the plague in his diary, writing, "How empty the streets are, and how melancholy. So many poor sick people in the streets full of sores." One eyewitness said that London became so quiet that everyday life was like Sunday, and grass started to grow in the streets. Pepys wrote in his diary that the plague is making us cruel as dogs to one another. Daniel Defoe, in his Journal of the Plague Year 60 years later, wrote, "Nothing was to be seen but wagons and carts, with goods, women, servants, children, coaches filled with people of the better sort, and horsemen attending them, and all hurrying away."
Londoners knew about plague because it had been around in London for centuries, but they knew enough to be very afraid of it. If you possibly could, you would get out of London. That's the best advice. But of course, many hundreds of thousands of people can't do that. They have to stay because they're too poor to move, because they need the work, or because they haven't got anywhere to go. So for those who stay in London, anxiety about infection is very strong indeed. And in the medical thinking of the time, fear can itself be a killer. Samuel Pepys has a couple of cases in which he talks about people who actually die of fear because they suddenly think they've been exposed to plague, to a dead person, or to somebody who's recently been infected. So fear itself is a killer, or is thought to be a killer. And the atmosphere in London at that time must have been one of extreme anxiety and, of course, of grief for those who had been lost.
The rich ran away, including King Charles II of England, his family and his court, who left the city for Salisbury, moving on to Oxford. Great fears of the sickness in the city, continued Pepys in his diary. He didn't buy a new wig that year, fearing it has been made with hair taken from the dead in the most infected parts of the city. Witnessing drinking in the tavern, he wrote, "The taverns are full of gadabouts making merry this eve, and though I may press my face against the window like an urchin at a confectioner's, I am tempted not by the sweetmeats within. A dram in exchange for the pox is an ill bargain indeed." As the number of victims affected mounted up, health bills of mortality were issued, and burial grounds became overfull, and pits were dug to accommodate the dead. Drivers of dead carts travelled the streets calling, "Bring out your dead," and carted away piles of bodies. The authorities became concerned that the number of deaths might cause public alarm, and ordered that body removal and internment should take place only at night. Many of these plague pits or burial grounds are now lost or lie underneath London streets and buildings. But here on the banks of the River Thames in Isleworth, West London, in an ancient churchyard, a stone plaque under a yew tree marks a burial place where 140 victims were laid to rest. Thinking bad air was involved in transmission, the authorities ordered giant bonfires to be burned in the streets and house fires to be kept burning night and day in the hope that the air would be cleansed. Tobacco was thought to be a prophylactic, and it was later said that no London tobacconist had died from the plague during the epidemic. By late autumn, the death toll in London and the suburbs began to slow, until in February 1666, it was considered safe enough for the king and his entourage to come back to the city. With the return of the monarch, others came back too, including the gentry who returned in their carriages accompanied by carts piled high with their belongings. The subsequent Great Fire of London ruined many city merchants and property owners. As a result, London was largely rebuilt. The street plan of the capital remained relatively unchanged, but the use of brick or stone was mandatory, and many gracious new buildings were constructed. Rebuilding took over 10 years. The architect Sir Christopher Wren was involved in the rebuilding of St Paul's Cathedral and more than 50 London churches. In fact, out of the fire and pestilence flowed a renaissance in the arts and sciences in England. Once the plague was over, the population of London recovered surprisingly quickly. People returned to the capital, and new people came to take over jobs left vacant by those who had died. There was a sudden rise in the number of marriages and births. The 19th century would become an age of great advancement in the fight against disease.
19th century, what you had was the beginning of what I would call globalization. You know, you had the rise of steamships, you had development of railroads, and it was in the 19th century that you first started to have worldwide pandemics. You know, cholera had existed for a long time in India and had been pretty much confined to India. All of a sudden, you have it transmitted all around the world so that every continent that's inhabited comes in contact with cholera.
If Jenner was a father of vaccinology, it was another English physician, John Snow, who became known as the father of epidemiology. Here in Broadwick Street, in the heart of London's Soho, stands a pub in his name, on the spot where Snow discovered that a contaminated water pump was the cause of a cholera outbreak that had killed 500.
He logged all the cases in Soho in London, so he created a spot map of where cholera cases developed, and then he tested the theory. Was it something to do with where people got their water from? And there were two different pumps that supplied water, And he managed to establish that if you stop people gathering water from a particular pump, cholera didn't occur in that population group. So therefore, putting two and two together, cholera seemed to be associated with water, with the water supply. Previously, it was thought of as a miasmatic environmental disease. So epidemiology led us to a scientific conclusion that it's something to do with the water. So even though we didn't know precisely what was in the water, we could actually control the disease by cleaning up the water and making the supply safe.
In 1854, Snow had traced the deaths to people who had used the pump, and he removed its handle. As part of a memorial, a replica has now been erected on the site of the original pump. This was one of the first instances of relying on geography and statistical analysis to track a disease outbreak. But Europe was soon to witness one of the greatest breakthroughs in disease medicine. Louis Pasteur, known as the father of microbiology, is credited with the discovery of the germ theory of disease. Pasteur's work involved magnification of pathogens or germs and the identification of antibodies that could attack them, leading to the discovery of vaccines for diseases such as rabies and anthrax.
We actually understood for the first time what infection was, that it was caused by germs that are transmitted from one individual to another or are caught from environmental sources, and that this is what's causing these diseases. And it's very hard to unthink that, to try and think, well, what was it like to not know that there were such things as viruses and bacteria, and that washing your hands was important. It's a tremendous leap forward in human understanding that has cascaded throughout the world. And in every part of the world, people understand that now. That's a triumph.
It caused a sensation at the time, you can imagine. Members of the royal family, wealthy people flocked to Paris to be treated by Pasteur.
And Pasteur was an incredible experimental scientist as well. He was also a chemist. And so he was able to drive home through scientific evidence. It was actually quite controversial. The vaccination wasn't immediately popular. And he had to do very dangerous experiments, for example, working with rabid dogs in the middle of Paris. But he had the force of personality to convince, first of all, French society, but then more broadly society, that vaccines that he was developing were of value, and they were then imprinted onto the mentality of medical practice.
Only decades after Pasteur's discoveries, Europe was plunged into World War I. Although a vaccine had been discovered for typhoid, which saved many troops' lives, the war became a trigger for the next global pandemic. Press coverage of the growing influenza was limited, except in neutral Spain, hence the name Spanish flu.
We don't know where the Spanish influenza virus emerged. The first sort of signal were in large army camps, both in the United States, but also in Northern Europe, when suddenly a large number of young soldiers developed, this short but rapid illness with a rapid onset, which was recognized as a form of flu. The severe cases developed pneumonia. But the signature was large numbers of people had to be hospitalized.
It is estimated that anywhere from 20 to 100 million people were killed worldwide, equivalent of 1/3 of Europe's population at the time, and more than double the number killed in World War I.
Scientists have retrieved viral genetic material from the Spanish influenza virus from all over the world, reconstructed the whole genome. We know exactly what the genes of H1N1 Spanish influenza look like, but we still don't understand why it is that it disproportionately affected young adults in the prime of life. That is, people between the ages of 20 to 40, the breadwinners, the heads of households, the most productive segment of the population. They were the ones that bore the brunt of the mortality. Elderly people, aged 70 or over, didn't, generally speaking, develop such severe illness. Why was that? We don't know. It's an immunological puzzle that persists to this day.
World War I lasted for 5 long years, and its many monuments attest to its legacy. More people died in the Spanish flu pandemic, but this is largely forgotten.
Most of the severe illness and death was collapsed into this 3-month period from September 1918 to December of 1918. And that meant that afterwards, it was kind of pretty rapidly forgotten in terms of there were no real monuments. Of course, people who experienced it and had to bury, husbands or children who had to bury parents would never forget the experience. But that was by and large a private experience. It wasn't memorialized in public.
It did appear among the work of some artists of the time, and Egon Schiele's The Family has come to embody the disease. Schiele depicts himself, his wife and daughter, all 3 of whom would die from the illness before the painting could be completed. The virus also mutated, resulting in a more virulent strain, leading to an even more lethal second wave.
The same disease came back, but it probably never really gone away. It was probably already in all these communities and circulating invisibly worldwide, when it then produced a new and dramatic wave of severe illness where the death rate was much, much more elevated. So this is typical. Pandemics come in waves, and depending on the incubation period of the virus and whether people develop evident symptoms or whether they're asymptomatic. So when someone's asymptomatic, you don't know if they're infected or not. And that's the big danger.
Today, the viruses, thousands of them, continue to evolve. Many of these diseases continue to originate in Asia and Africa. It's just a matter of time before another major outbreak occurs in this region of the world. In 2018 alone, there were outbreaks of typhoid in Pakistan, cholera in Yemen, plague in Madagascar, monkeypox in Nigeria, MERS in Saudi Arabia during the Hajj, and Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
The most vulnerable population in the world are children living in low and middle income countries. And for the last 20 or 30 years, these children have been dying in their hundreds of thousands. For example, in Yemen, there were hundreds of thousands of children got cholera and died in the last 10 years, and they were ignored essentially by society. So I'm hoping that we don't only remember the impact on us in the richest countries, but we also recognize that this impact is ongoing in the poorer countries.
The outbreaks of the AIDS virus in the early 1980s were perceived as a Western disease afflicting the gay community, but its origins were in Africa, where it devastated the population. Treatment centres like this one in Mozambique were still active 20 years later.
HIV is a problem because, again, it's been impossible to come up with a vaccine despite lots of attempts. But the good news with HIV is that we have come up with antiretroviral drugs quite quickly after the virus was discovered. We came up with drugs that worked, and quite quickly after that we came up with highly effective antiretroviral treatment that meant that you basically could treat HIV in the same way as you could treat diabetes. Okay, you couldn't cure a person of it, but just like someone with diabetes, if they take insulin, they can live a normal life. Patients with HIV infection can live a normal life if they take their therapy.
All the coronaviruses that caused recent epidemics, including COVID-19, jumped from bats to another animal before infecting humans. It's difficult to predict precisely what chain of events cause a pandemic, but one thing is certain: these risks can be mitigated by developing strategies to minimize ecological disturbances.
Climate change is going to be an increasing challenge in this world in terms of resulting in the possibility of future pandemics.
You could argue in a way that the coronavirus has done us a favor because it's forcing us, we can no longer ignore the way that we disrupt our own environment. And quite frankly, you know, even though we'd had we've known for 10 years or more that we are causing climate change and global warming. We really didn't do anything about it. You know, there was no real political will to follow through. The reason for that is we're very bad at long-term thinking. The political cycle and the news cycle means that, you know, cultural amnesia is built into our daily lives. But we have to get better at it. You know, this has been a huge wake-up call.
There is an urgent need to prevent deforestation and reduce animal-human interactions, and a comprehensive global surveillance system to monitor the emergence of these diseases will help us fight these deadly and terrifying epidemics.
A lot of these vectors do better in hotter weather, which means that as the world heats up, these vectors will have increased range, which means that pathogens that used to be confined to rather localized regions, because that's where the vectors were found, all of a sudden are able to transmit more widely. You know, so for instance, mosquitoes tend to breed much better and faster in warmer temperatures.
Climate change removes and alters animals' habitats, changing how they live, where they live, and who eats whom. The way humans live has also changed. 55% of the global population now live in cities, up from 35% 50 years ago. And these bigger cities provide new homes for wildlife: rats, raccoons, foxes, birds, jackals, monkeys, which can live in the green spaces such as parks and gardens of the waste humans leave behind. Often wildlife species are more successful in cities than in the wild because of the plentiful food supply, making urban spaces a melting pot for evolving diseases. An unprecedented shift in human population is one reason why more diseases originate in Asia and Africa. The most rapid urbanization is happening here, where the majority of the world's population now lives.
I'm 29 years, one wife, 2 children. I have no job. What do you want? What do you want?
If we get a movement of refugees, climate-based refugees, not only do you have a conduit of populations with all the pathogens that they are carrying, moving from one part of the world to the other, but when you have refugees, often they do not have access to adequate water supplies, safe water, or adequate public health measures, and that may not be where their biggest priorities are. And so all of those conditions are very conducive to future outbreaks.
And in the age of global air travel, human interconnectivity can aggravate the transmission of diseases. As COVID-19 showed, an infectious disease that starts in one part of the world can spread globally in virtually no time whatsoever.
In 2019, there were over 4 billion flights that people took. You know, so when you have people flying quickly long distances, many people flying quickly over long distances, that serves to connect the world. People travel fast relative to the recovery time of the pathogen. You know, so it means that someone can be infected at the beginning of their journey and still be infected at the end of their journey with very little change in health conditions. So that's new. I think the other thing that's different is that when you had these pathogens traveling by steam boats, by trains, the routes that they could take were somewhat limited, which gave a possibility of greater control. You know, that you could establish quarantines, you could establish public health measures to restrict the flow of these pathogens in controlled ways. Now there are so many routes from one country to another, so many ways that things can progress from one country to another, or one region to another, that it's much harder to control in the same ways.
But of course, we do need to keep the economy moving. We still need to keep foodstuffs, you know, flying between countries. So you know, there's a balance there. But these were not problems people had in 1918 when we had much shorter supply chains. In Europe, at least in Britain and France, the belligerent nations were all on a wartime footing. So they depended on their own resources for their food supplies. We live in a different world, and that presents pathogen like COVID with new opportunities.
The COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020 turned airports around the world into giant ghost towns. As aircraft worth billions remained parked on runways, massive testing centres for remaining key workers were established on airport perimeters. While the economic impact of this latest pandemic will be felt for many years.
Exposed to an infected person, you must self-isolate for 14 days. Play your part and do the right thing so we can safely
In the meantime,
return to
colossal
normal.
efforts are being made to understand, contain, and find cures to infectious diseases. At Cambridge University, this deep containment facility has been built to do just this. Run by Professor Gordon Dugan, it is a state-of-the-art facility.
Outside of the facility, there's a cage. That cage is what we call an anti-terrorism, anti-threat cage that prevents people getting into this facility who we don't want in the facility.
We cannot help but grow these organisms in the lab, and we should see this as a key part of our frontline defences against these organisms. And the idea that we should just keep them all locked away and never touch them is a naive approach.
We have COVID-19, the SARS-2 virus growing here. We have the HIV virus capability in this facility. And on the bacterial side, we have the ability to grow the typhoid organism, the organism that causes typhoid, which is actually a bacteria, and we have a room for that.
The latest pandemic, like others before, has had massive lifestyle implications.
So I'm an infectious disease expert, and when I travel into areas where I know diseases, I'm very careful about the way I manage myself in that environment. Social distancing, natural. Handling and touching objects, natural. I think that will become much more as a natural instinct. I think it is a natural instinct that we've lost, and I think that will become more instinctive in people. They'll ask the question, am I likely to be infected by this kind of interaction? And sometimes it will become natural.
As part of the plan to help London reopen carefully, safely and sustainably, TfL is making it easier and safer to walk and cycle more. We're asking all Londoners to do this wherever possible, saving space on public transport for those who must use it. Walking and cycling will also help improve London's air quality and is great for your mental and physical well-being.
All aspects of our daily life have been affected, from office workers working from home to eating habits.
There are huge challenges for like the meat packing industry, which we've now discovered are like, you know, incubators, hives of coronavirus, right? That puts on the table, if I can put it that way, the whole question of meat consumption. As the economies speed up and more people come to cities, you need more and more animal protein to feed those labor forces. So this is a huge question for the world going forward. Now we've seen the power that pandemics have to disrupt not just social life, but economic life and political life. They're huge stress tests. What a pandemic does is it stresses, it shows where all the fissures and cracks are in your economy and in your political systems of governance. And it also asks very tough questions of politicians. Who is up to the job? Who is actually capable of sorting out this mess?
So as long as we have a society based upon constant disruption, there will be continued and increasing opportunities for pathogens to take advantage of the resulting opportunities that arise.
The key point is that we use our faculty of reason to understand what's going on here and to work out what are the interventions that we need to apply and put those in place. And that's where we've made tremendous advances in the last 150 years in our understanding. Obviously, every death is a tragedy, but this is a struggle we are, on balance, winning, and we will win this battle in the end. I'm certain of that.